Good morning, eighth grade. Good afternoon, whenever you are tuning into this video. But I just wanted to provide a resource for some of us if we need it for the reading that we went over in class about Beethoven. And also, I'm going to post a link if you have no idea who Beethoven is, why he's important, and you kind of want to build some background. There is a very short clip that I am going to include. You can click on it, and in less than 5 minutes, you can hear why it's so important, music that he is responsible for, and why he is famous, and what made his struggle so important to his success. Okay, so we were asked to read a passage, and we know that we read for three reasons, right? We read to be informed, we read to be entertained, and we read to be persuaded. So when we watch movies, when we watch, we read books, we hear different people talk. There are usually three ways, three reasons why they are doing what they're doing. So it's either to inform, to entertain, or to persuade. Okay, we are focusing on informational texts. And as Mr. Yoder said in class, informational texts are factual, they have evidence, nothing is made up. So the structure of something that is an informational text, whether it is an essay, a speech, an interview, a novel, a biography, any of those things, okay, the setup is much different from, say, reading Lord of the Flies, right? So I'm going to pull up the article. I want to point out some text features, why they are important. I will do the reading if you can follow along as I read. And then I will read the questions and go over the language in the questions, because part of when we are taking a test is being able to read and understand what the question is asking. So many times there are questions written that try to trick us. And I want to teach you or make you aware of some words to really look out for. So let me share my screen. Okay, so Beethoven, the man and his music. I am going to include the link if you want to learn a little bit more, build some background about him. But we are talking about a musical composer, okay? And I really want you to pay attention to the text features. When I talk about text features, this is what I mean. I mean, why is the title of the article bold? Why is this bold? Why is this bold? What is this called? So these are called headings. And the reason why headings are so important is because it tells us what we are going to be reading about. So after we read this first paragraph about Beethoven, it breaks it down into different periods. So here is the early period, that is the heading. So we are probably going to be talking about the early period back in history, okay? The middle period, okay? And as you can see, just eyeballing this, by 1798, that is a long time ago. So we're not talking about something recent, okay? And there are times in history, whoops, I'm still annotating. There are times in history when they called the time periods such as the early period, the middle period, and then you're going to see on the next page the late period. So let me just clear this, get out of this. Okay, and I'm just going to skim through it with you. I also want to point out this right here. So you will see this on the PSSAs. If there is something like a word or something that a lot of people definitely are not familiar with, you will find it. It's kind of like a personal dictionary a little glossary, if you will. So we know that we are going to be reading about a G6. And if you don't know what a G6 is or how it's used in the context, it says it gives you the definition. So please pay attention to these individual glossaries and the definitions so that you can answer the questions and make sure that you use all of these things, all of the tools, the headings, the subheadings, the glossaries, the definitions, the titles, all of these, they have the answers in them. So a G6 is a high note key 71 of 88 keys on a piano with a sound frequency of 1,583 hertz. Okay, just for you to know. Let me clear this. And I am just going to continue to go to the next page, see if I want to point out anything to you. Okay. Oh, wait, I see two more headings. So let me make sure you see them. The late period, that is a heading, okay? Headings are in bold and they usually precede text, a couple paragraphs, but it tells us what we are going to be reading about. So the first heading on this page, the late period. The second heading, questions remain. And then we have another text feature. Please take a look, see if you can find it. Can someone please tell me, what is this called? What is that called? I'll wait for you. Think in your head, call it out, even though I can't hear you right now. So I just pulled up some of the text features that we talked about in class. Okay, so who can point out what we've already seen? We've seen the headings, we've seen the glossary. Okay, I asked you to look at the last part of that passage and what was there. So all of you should be able to tell me it was a table and it is a timeline of events, okay? It is a graphic. That is very important. So again, if we wanted to use that graphic and the timeline, it would tell us all the things that we just read, kind of in a nutshell. So let me pull back up the passage and we are going to read and review why Beethoven is important and why the informational text presented to us is important. Okay, Beethoven, the man and his music. All right, I will read it aloud and I want all of you to listen, please. Here we go. Beethoven, the man and his music. Many people have wondered if there is a connection between Ludwig van Beethoven's music and his loss of hearing. 3 researchers from the University of Amsterdam in the Netherlands did more than wonder. They set out to unravel this musical mystery by comparing Beethoven's life to his music. The trio believes they may have discovered information to support the theory that Beethoven's deafness greatly influenced his music. The early period. And you should be thinking in your head, what kind of text feature is this? Beethoven's work is divided into 3 periods, each with distinct styles of music. During the early period, Beethoven had his hearing. He often performed publicly, and his compositions utilized a full range of notes. The research team began with these early works, choosing to examine the musical scores of Beethoven's string quartets and focusing on the first violin part of the first movement. Then they counted the number of high notes above G6. Notice the little number 1 next to G6. That is because it takes you to the glossary that we talked about at the bottom of the page, and it tells every single person what a G6 is. It's a high note. It's key 71 of 88 keys on the piano, and then it tells us the sound frequency. That must be important if they're telling us that. Careful analysis showed that 8% of the total notes fell within the high range. Okay, so you have a lower range on a piano or in music, and then you have your high range. Then we have the middle period. By 1798, Beethoven had begun to lose his hearing. He confided concerns over his hearing loss in a letter to an old childhood friend. My hearing during these last 3 years has become gradually worse. To give you some idea of my extraordinary deafness, I must tell you that in the theater I am obliged to lean close up against the orchestra in order to understand the actors, and when a little way off, I hear none of the high notes of instruments or singers. That was a letter written from Beethoven to a friend, Franz Wegler, in 1801. As Beethoven's hearing gradually decreased, his productivity increased. Beethoven composed masterpiece after masterpiece. The researchers believe this growth in productivity was stimulated by Beethoven's desire to compose all he could before becoming completely deaf. This middle period, however, is known not only for the quantity of work. His compositions during this time are described as brilliant, bold, striking, and groundbreaking. Let's go to the next page. The research team applied the same magnifying glass approach to this period's quartets as they had with earlier ones. They discovered that Beethoven's use of high frequency notes dropped as his hearing decreased, as low as 1.5% of the middle frequency notes. This directly ties into Beethoven's losing the ability to hear high frequency notes during the onset of his deafness, the late period. By 1812, Beethoven needed ear trumpets, early hearing aids to hear conversation. A few years later, friends had to communicate with him through writing. Historians believe that by 1825, he could no longer hear conversation. Beethoven had completely lost his hearing by the end of his late period of composing. The pace of his productivity also slowed, yet surprisingly, the researchers found that high frequency notes had returned to his compositions. Once again, he wrote with a full range of notes. Beethoven was no longer composing music he could hear. With little or no hearing to rely on, Beethoven composed from his memory of sound. Questions remain. Although the researchers' theory that Beethoven's deafness greatly influenced his music is interesting, no one, including the researchers themselves, is ready to accept it as a fact. The researchers examined only the string quartets, not the whole body of Beethoven's works. Also, the information on Beethoven's deafness is anecdotal. That might be a new word for us, so we need to highlight that, underline it, do something with it if we don't know what it is. Okay, anecdotal. Save that in your brain for after we're done reading. There are no hearing tests or medical records to support the findings, only letters and the observations of friends. A more extensive study of music and the man will have to be undertaken to prove or disprove the theory. And then we have our graphic, our timeline below that highlights Beethoven's musical periods through the early period, middle period, late period, and what happens when he started to lose his hearing, the difficulties he had, and then when he passed. Okay, the word anecdotal, if you go back, let me put on the annotate here. Anecdotal, okay? There are a lot of teachers that take anecdotal notes, okay? Anecdotal notes. We're gonna use our context clues and keep reading. The next sentence says, there are no hearing tests or medical records to support the findings, just the observations of friends. So there was no test, no exam, no assessment that would support the findings, just observations. So anecdotal is an observation that someone makes. Okay, the teachers usually write it down a little bit. Okay, this student knows this many letters, this many sounds in early reading. So it is not an assessment, but more so an observation. That is the vocabulary word, anecdotal. And then the last part, since we read it, the objective today was that you were going to be able to answer 2 out of 2 textual evidence-based informational text questions correctly. There are 2 questions. You should see them on the screen. Number 1, what conclusion can you draw about Beethoven during his late period? And number 2, which sentence best supports the answer in number 1? 8th grade, these questions are both tied together. So if you get one wrong, then you're probably going to get the next one wrong. So that's why it is so important, again, to use the text features to help us. And I'm going to show you what I mean. All right. Question number 1 says, what conclusion can you draw about Beethoven during his late period? The late period is a heading. So where I would find the information I need is I'm going to go back to the part that has the heading, the late period. And I'm going to reread that. Okay, you have to do that right now because we're not just picking answers. We need to know where we're finding the answers. Okay, what conclusion can you draw about Beethoven during his late period? I will read the choices for you. You now know you only have 2 paragraphs where you're going to find the answer underneath the heading, the late period. So please look. Is it A, Beethoven's interest in music rose again? B, Beethoven found composing very difficult? C, Beethoven was tired of using low frequency notes? Or D, Beethoven's hearing no longer affected his music? Somewhere you're going to find it. Okay, and number 2, now we are going to use the textual evidence to support our answer. Which sentence best supports the answer in number 1? So go back and find that sentence where you got that answer from. Is it A, the pace of his productivity also slowed? B, yet surprisingly, the researchers found that high frequency notes had returned to his compositions? C, once again, he wrote with a full range of notes? Or D, with little or no hearing to rely on? Beethoven composed from his memory of sound. Okay, so please find that for me. Who answered 2 of the 2 questions correctly, showing that you understand your text features and finding evidence in the text.